Welcome back, everyone, to Occult Archives, where we kind of like dust off and crack open some of history's most, well, I guess you could say notorious books.
Yeah, I think notorious is a good word for them, right?
Yeah.
Because we're not talking about like the best sellers of the ancient world, you know?
Right, right.
These are the ones that people kind of whispered
Yeah.
about.
The ones that maybe got hidden away.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And instead of just like, reading the Wikipedia entry or something, we are going to do a deep dive into the actual source material to try to understand what made these books so potent, what made people afraid of them.
You know, what kind of cultural anxieties or worldviews are reflected in these pages?
Exactly. Yeah. And today for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at episode 153, so to speak, Ghosts of the Empire, Etruscan Magic in Modern Italy. And I love this one because it's not so much about, grimoires or like, overtly magical texts, but it's more about how do we see traces of the ancient Etruscan worldview?
Yeah, their beliefs, their
Right.
practices.
Yeah, in modern Italy, so centuries later, what's still kind of echoing.
Right, and how these ideas have transformed and adapted over time.
Exactly. Yeah, and the Etruscans are fascinating because they predate even the Romans, you know?
They're kind of like the mysterious precursors.
Yeah, they're like the the foundation upon which so much of Roman culture was built, but with their own very distinct flavor.
Right, and a lot of that's been lost to history.
Right,
So
right.
what we're trying to do is kind of piece together that puzzle of like what can we still glean from these surviving fragments.
Yeah, and I think one of the most compelling places to start is with the idea of the survival of ancient deities, right?
All right.
Like how these figures that were so central to their understanding of the world might still be kind of lurking in the shadows.
Right, not always with the same names,
Right.
but maybe with some of their attributes transformed or maybe a new name, but still with that kind of underlying essence.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not always a one-to-one correspondence. It's more like these echoes and whispers, right?
Exactly.
So like one example is the Mania della Notte.
Oh, the spirit of nightmare.
Yes, yes. And Enrico Rossi back in 1891 noted that like while she was once a known figure in Galliata, the memory of her was already kind of fading even then. So
Right, so it speaks to how these beliefs kind of have a lifespan too, right?
exactly. Some fade, some adapt.
Some morph into something else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have like Teramo, which is such a great name.
It's a great name.
And this one, there's like a possible lineage, back to the Roman Mercury,
Right.
and even further back, maybe to the Etruscan terms.
And then that possibly became Termis, and then Teramo in the Romagnolo dialect. So
Yeah, it's like you can see the word transforming across time.
yeah, language itself is like a vessel for this cultural memory.
It's fascinating. And this Teramo figure was associated with merchants and thieves.
Right, so that kind of trickster element.
Right, a little bit mischievous.
Yeah.
And there's even a recorded invocation for him. So, people were still actively engaging with this figure centuries later.
And the fact that his association with like trade and even trickery like that has persisted for so long, it's really telling.
Yeah, yeah. Contrast that with like Tinia, who is linked to the Greco-Roman Jupiter, but there's a different feeling about it,
Yeah, there's a different energy.
Yeah, like a lot of the Etruscan deities connected to thunder and storms, they seem to have been seen as more malevolent, inspiring more fear than Jupiter did.
It's like a more raw, untamed understanding of those forces.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's not this like, majestic king of the gods. It's more like
It's elemental.
it's primal and powerful.
Yeah.
But it's not all doom and gloom,
Not at all.
We have Pan, for instance. And in Primal Core in 1891, C. Placidi noted that Pan was still recognized.
So there?
Yeah. And Pan, of course, was associated with the wind and that sudden irrational terror that we call panic.
Right, that just takes over.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is the recorded invocation to Pan that Placidi mentions is quite elaborate. It doesn't seem like it was just made up on the spot by the person saying it.
Right. It suggests a deeper tradition, like a more structured belief system that
Yeah.
survived.
Yeah, right, right. And then we have Feronia.
Ah, Feronia, the goddess of marketplaces and fairs.
Yes, and there's some debate about her origins, Etruscan or Sabine, but she definitely had a presence in Etruscan temples. And what's interesting is her possible link to like strolling performers, those traveling entertainers who would have been a fixture of these bustling places.
It makes sense when you think about it, right? Marketplaces, you have the commerce, but you also have the entertainment.
Yeah, that energy of people coming together.
Exactly. And there's even a mention of the connection to mania.
Oh, wow.
which is interesting, right? Like the spirit of nightmare.
Yeah, it's almost like this undercurrent of unpredictability, in these places.
Absolutely.
And then we have Sylvanus, the Roman god of the countryside.
Sylvan.
Yeah, who appears as like a benevolent spirit in Tuscan tales.
Right, so he's kind of like a helpful figure.
Yeah, like a protector of the rural world.
Yeah.
And then Carmenta, who is still known as like this spirit who watches over children, aids in childbirth, and is generally like beloved by mothers.
A protector of the family.
Right. And there's even an invocation shared, that echoes these concerns about fertility and the well-being of the family, these kind of timeless human anxieties.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are concerns that transcend any particular time or place.
Yeah, yeah. And then here's a really interesting one. Faflon?
Faflon.
Yeah, maybe connected to Faflo or Faflon. And this is a spirit that people apparently inquired about at marketplaces.
Like the marketplace.
Yeah, like imagine you're going to get your groceries and you're asking about Faflon.
That's fascinating.
I know. And there's the story of a peasant who kept blessing Faflon even when things went wrong and eventually received a reward. And the source even suggests this could be a survival of Bacchus.
Wow, so the Roman god of wine and revelry transformed into this more localized figure.
Yeah, right. It's so interesting how these major figures from the Roman pantheon can kind of filter down into these more localized folk beliefs.
It's almost like they get repurposed, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then we have Cordoglio, who is the spirit of joy and harmony.
What a wonderful name.
I know, and the invocation to him is just lovely. It's basically like, please fill my home with happiness and good fortune, you know?
Yeah, it's a very straightforward request.
Yeah, but it's so universal, right? That desire for peace and contentment.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about the lassie or lassie.
The lassie or lassie?
Yeah, and these are ancestral spirits appearing after a family death, and they're connected to the lassa mentioned in ancient Latin texts. What's really striking is the link to the concept of the genius, right? The inherent spirit of a family.
Right, that kind of like guiding force.
Right, and the idea that the ancestors are revived in youth and beauty, it's a really powerful image.
It is. It speaks to this idea of like the continuity of the family lineage.
Yeah, and this connection to the ancestors. I mean, that's something that's so widespread across so many cultures.
It's a very human impulse.
It is, and then there's Lara, or Larunda, the silent goddess.
Oh, the silent goddess.
Yeah. And the suggestion is that she was a good spirit, a happy spirit, and she's even linked to the origin of the Lauras, those Roman household deities.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so the protectors of the home.
Right.
And then we have Bergoia, who, after death, became a spirit of thunder and lightning.
A fiery spirit.
Yeah, and she could be helpful or harmful depending on how she was received. So again, that theme of respecting the power of the spirit world.
Right, you have to approach these figures with caution.
Yeah, yeah. And then Gonzio, the spirit in charge of horses.
Gonzio.
Yeah, and instead of being like this fearsome figure, he was more of a prankster, especially if the stable master was impatient.
Oh, so he'd make the horses act up.
Yeah, but not to cause serious harm, more just for his own amusement, it seems.
Like a supernatural stable hand with a sense of humor.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And then there's Albina, who specifically helps lovers if they invoke her at dawn, especially those suffering from unrequited love.
Oh, so a spirit of love and hope.
Yeah, and there's a whole ritual, rising before daybreak, kneeling in an open field. It's quite romantic.
It is. It shows you how universal the themes of love and longing are.
Yeah, they transcend time and culture.
Absolutely.
The tale of Verbio is a little bit tragic. He was this beautiful youth who was scorned in love and seemingly died, and there's a connection made to Diana, or Artemis and Verbius, the man in the moon.
Oh, interesting.
So again, these echoes of classical mythology.
Yeah, and these themes of lost love and transformation, those are so timeless.
Yeah, yeah. And then Duccio, who's described as a Folletto, a kind of goblin or mischievous spirit who likes to sit on girls' shoulders and play pranks.
A mischievous spirit.
Yeah, and there's a connection to Augustine's accounts of Sylvani and Fani, those playful woodland spirits, and even the French Ducie. And there's even an anecdote about Duccio burning a girl named Virginia's love letters.
Oh, boy.
Talk about interference.
A little too involved, maybe.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Then there's Remel, a spirit associated with hindering the work of a mill. And the name might even be related to the Italian remolare, which means to slow down or retard.
To hinder.
Yeah, and it's so easy to picture, people back then blaming this mysterious spirit when the mill stops working.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a scapegoat.
Yeah, yeah. And then even Janus gets a mention.
Oh, Janus, the two-headed Roman god.
Yeah, and he's linked to mysteries, prudence, even Baphomet and overcoming evil. So the source suggests that his influence might still be felt in modern traditions, maybe in more symbolic ways.
Yeah, it makes sense he was the god of doorways and beginnings and endings.
Right, transitions.
Yeah, so those are very universal themes.
They are, yeah. And then Floria, who might be connected to Flora Horta or Norcia, and she's presented as a spirit associated with fate, sometimes depicted with a hammer. And there's this fascinating story about Floria, a witch and a bewitched child, where Floria seems to be the one who was wronged.
Oh, that's interesting, like a reversal of the usual witch narrative?
Yeah. Yeah, and it raises questions about, like, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys in these stories.
It's more complicated than it seems.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Bella Marta.
Bella Marta.
Yeah, who is invoked by naked girls using tarot cards to determine the truth of a lover.
That's a very specific ritual.
I know, right?
Uh-huh.
And she's linked to Madame Matuta, which is Venus, and there's a note about the church's disapproval of these invocations, which makes sense, but the source suggests a possible link to the Etruscan Venus Myrcia and the Morning Star.
So it's like this really interesting blend of ancient and more recent beliefs.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And then finally, in our look at surviving deities, we have Diana and Herodias mentioned as the queens of witches. And this belief is traced back to the Council of Ancira and later witch trials.
So that association has a very long history.
Yeah, it's a very persistent image.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've seen a lot of potential survival of these ancient deities, but our source material goes even deeper than that. It actually talks about specific magical practices and beliefs that seem to have their roots in this ancient soil.
So we're going beyond the figures themselves and looking at how people actually interacted with the supernatural.
Exactly. Yeah, and one of the most striking things is just the persistent belief in bewitchment.
Right.
You know, I mean, there's an account of a mob outburst in Milan in 1891 against a woman accused of bewitching a child. So this is not just folklore. This is real-world fear and reaction.
Absolutely. And it shows how deeply ingrained these beliefs were in the culture, even in a modernizing city like Milan.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really unsettling.
It is.
We also see mentions of using blessed herbs for protection, which is something that's so widespread across cultures. It almost feels like a universal human impulse.
Yeah, that desire to find safeguards in the natural world.
Yeah, yeah. The legend of the Infusa, also called Infrusa or Infusa, is quite dark.
Oh yeah, that's a creepy one.
This wicked witch whose soul becomes a crow and whose hidden treasure haunts her palace. And the nephew's encounter with the reassembling body parts is just terrifying.
It's like something out of a nightmare.
It is. And while there's a connection to the Greek Empusa, the Tuscan version has its own unique and quite gruesome details.
It's like the story has evolved to fit the local context.
Yeah, it's taken on its own life.
Yeah.
We hear about the protective power of the white thorn and even pig entrails against witches. And there's a connection made between the Latin Cardea and Caradora in this context.
So very specific objects
Right.
with very specific protective qualities.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how those associations develop.
It makes you wonder about the logic behind them.
Yeah, yeah. There's a charm involving Bugin to protect crops from rust, complete with a ritual using heated grains.
So a very practical kind of magic.
Yeah, directly addressing the concerns of an agricultural community.
Yeah, making sure the harvest is safe.
Right, right. The tale of Tirana, a fairy who performs miracles using 3 winning cards, is interesting because it links playing cards, which evolved from dice, back to the Roman Venus throw, which was the luckiest roll of the dice.
Oh, wow. So it's like these ancient superstitions adapting to new forms of entertainment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that desire for luck. I mean, that's something that's never gone away.
It's a universal human desire.
It is, the idea of witches being freed from suffering by giving up their treasure or passing on their power is a recurring motif. You know, it suggests that witchcraft is kind of like a burden that can be relinquished.
It can be transferred.
Yeah, almost like a curse that you can break.
Yeah, and it provides a kind of narrative resolution to these stories.
It does, yeah. The Romagnolo belief in painting interlaced serpents on walls for protection is really striking, and there are very specific instructions, you know, head down, tail up, and it extends to braided work and even like crossing threads in sewing as general protection against witches who can't count the threads.
So it's like weaving magic into the fabric of everyday life.
It is, yeah, and the idea that witches are compelled to count and are thus thwarted by these intricate patterns, I mean, that's such a common motif in folklore.
It is. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and this ties into an idea from Gaffarel, who argued that natural forms create this vast writing that's decipherable through inspiration and study. So it makes you wonder if that influenced the perception of these interlaced designs as having inherent magical meaning.
Right. It's like nature itself is providing clues to ward off evil.
Yeah, yeah. The law compelling witches to count grains of rice, sesame, or corn is another common one. And the use of rice or other textured surfaces like the salagrana stone as protection makes sense in this context.
It's like creating a magical obstacle course for the witch.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
There's a mention of the dread of unpremeditated praise because it was associated with bewitchment, which is a very cautious way of living, you know?
It's like always being wary of unintended consequences.
Yeah, yeah. The convolvulus things like honeysuckle and morning glory were seen as protection because of their twisted tendrils. So again, like nature providing a defense against
Yeah,
magic.
it's like a natural barrier.
Yeah, yeah. There's even a charm using plaited hair to cure a headache.
So a very personal form of folk medicine.
Yeah, using something that's directly connected to the body.
Right.
The myth of the infant goddess of the four winds being born to the sound of laurel and wrapped in roses is quite poetic.
It's a beautiful origin story.
Yeah, it really captures the imagination.
Yeah.
Locally, there was a belief that the Madonna of Fire and Dragons was originally a heathen deity that was absorbed into Christianity.
Oh, wow. So a pagan figure being Christianized.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon, this blending of old and new beliefs.
Yeah, it's a form of syncretism that you see throughout history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The cicada or grasshopper was seen as a prophetic spirit and the genius of song, and this is reflected in Romagnolo ballads. And there was even a practice of tying a cicada to a baby's cradle to bestow talent.
So to imbue the child with artistic ability.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a lovely image.
Yeah.
The Romagna seem to have a lot of tales about sylvan goblins like Ducio seducing maidens, and this is linked back to ancient beliefs about de minores, Sylvani and Fani. So it's like these old woodland spirits are finding new life in local folklore.
Yeah, their roles are adapting to changing social dynamics.
Right, right. The Etruscan Roman tradition of paired male and female deities that would cross is mentioned using Fauna and Cupra as an example.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a reminder of the complex relationships within ancient pantheons.
It's a whole different way of understanding divinity.
Yeah, yeah. The legend of the Great Walnut Tree in Benevento is wild. It was seen as a gathering place for witches cursed by a pope and surrounded by all sorts of strange superstitions, including serpent worship, and a girl eating a walnut and giving birth to a lamb, and then the tree transforming into a witch.
Wow. It's like a magnet for the supernatural.
It is. It's like this concentrated point of folklore.
Yeah.
There's also the story of Lambert, who was transformed by the witches at the tree and wasn't recognized when he came home.
So a complete transformation of identity.
Yeah, yeah. The idea of witchcraft being an endowment that can be voluntarily assumed or even unintentionally passed on is interesting. There's a story of a priest who inherited wizardry from a dying witch.
That's a great example of that idea of transmission.
It is, yeah, and it kind of blurs the lines between choice and fate.
Right.
There's a specific curse used against a witch involving throwing bewitched objects into the fire and striking blows on different parts of the house. So it's a very active and aggressive way of trying to break a spell.
Yeah, it's like a physical assault on the magic itself.
Yeah, yeah. There are brief mentions of omens found in hailstones and the mythical city of Magonia in the clouds. So again, these hints of hidden realms and supernatural signs.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that there's more to the world than we can see.
Yeah, yeah. The anecdote of a naked witch being thrown from a thunderstorm in Forchheim is quite traumatic.
Wow, talk about divine retribution.
I know, right?
Yeah.
The tale of witches traveling to Jerusalem for flowers in a magical boat and their encounter with a sick youth is fascinating because it shows them having seemingly ordinary needs alongside their extraordinary abilities.
Yeah, it humanizes them in a way.
It does, yeah, yeah. Pispi is introduced as a typical thief, and there's a connection made to the mandrake, which in Dutch folklore was associated with undetectable thievery. So again, these trickster figures and magical aids popping up across culture.
The universal archetype.
Yeah, yeah. The story of Patana and her betrayal by the unfed pot leading to her transformation is another classic fairy tale motif.
Transformation and escape.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's a Moorish tale involving a child born dark who miraculously speaks to exonerate his mother.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so again, this idea of divine intervention.
Restoring harmony.
Right, right. The figure of the goblin Saint Antonio is really interesting. He was seen by priests as a devil tempter, but by sorcerers as a venerated deity. And the practice of reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards or doubled to invoke heathen spirits specifically addressed to St. Anthony is really wild.
It is. It shows how Christianity and paganism could become intertwined in these folk beliefs.
Yeah, it's like a very fluid boundary. And then there are other sorcerer saints mentioned like Santo Liceo and Simeone, who is linked to Simon Magus. So again, this blending of old sorcery and Christianity.
It's like people were drawing on whatever power they could find.
Yeah, right. Regardless of like official doctrine.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a spell invoking Santo Elia against the evil eye, which again is such a widespread belief.
It's a universal fear.
Yeah, yeah. The novena to S. Vecchio Simeone for granting wishes comes with a warning to recite it carefully and with a fearless mind and the threat of a slap if you mess it up.
Oh, wow. So there are consequences.
Yeah, yeah. Sleeping in a pigsty for prophetic dreams is mentioned,
How interesting.
connecting the pig to truth in ancient cultures.
Yeah, that's an old association.
Yeah, yeah. The spider in folklore is seen as both good and bad, and the tarantella dance is linked to witches, and there's a spell using a spider to cure illness. So it's a creature with a very ambivalent reputation.
Yeah, both helpful and harmful.
Right, right. Lizards also pop up in folk medicine, historically hung alive for spleen ailments, and currently in Tuscany they have to have 2 tails.
Really?
Yeah, and the lizard's connection to Sightlight and Apollo helps us understand this a little better.
It does, yeah.
The source highlights the northern feel of Romagna folklore, suggesting Etruscan and Sabine origins despite potential later influences.
So, like, the ancient culture is still leaving its mark.
Yeah, yeah. Finding treasure with the help of birds is a Tuscan tradition that parallels the Latin legend of Adonnavius finding his pigs with birds.
Oh, interesting. So the same story with different details?
Yeah, but the underlying belief in the connection between animals and hidden knowledge is the same.
Yeah, yeah.
Falling stars are seen as omens, prompting people to make a wish. And there's a Tuscan children's game with acorns involving counting forwards and backwards for good luck. So it's like turning celestial events into these personal moments of hope.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah. Swallows were used for eye ailments, a practice documented by Marcellus of Bordeaux. So again, nature providing remedies.
Yeah, the natural world is a source of healing.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm.
Spells for sore eyes involving elder and making the sign of the cross show this blending of pagan and Christian elements.
Yeah, that syncretism again.
Exactly. There's a spell specifically to bind a witch, not her possession, so focusing on neutralizing the person.
Yeah, targeting the source of the harm.
Yeah, yeah. And then a spell using earthworms and their secrets of sorcery to cure a headache.
Earthworms, huh?
Yeah, it's very unusual, but it speaks to this belief that even these humble creatures might hold hidden knowledge.
It does, yeah.
The 4 things of good fortune, a red bag with bread, salt, rue, and cumin, and the associated charm is a classic example of a protective amulet.
Combining symbolic objects with intention.
Yeah, yeah. The verbena plant was favored by a certain fada for bestowing fortune, and taking it from a church altar was considered particularly lucky.
So again, that blending of pagan and Christian elements.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Remedies for hordeolus or eye grains using barley grains, elderflowers, and rue with a prayer to Santa Lucia are another example of the syncretic approach.
Yeah, drawing on different traditions.
Yeah. Spells to ensure a woman's fidelity involving a lizard caught with the left hand and the woman's sperma are certainly interesting.
To say the least.
Yeah, they speak to the anxieties around relationships.
Yeah, and the desire for control.
Right, right. The use of pitch in spells, both for sore throats and for breaking love, shows the continuity of certain materials and their associations across time.
You know, pitch has a long history in magic.
It does,
Yeah.
yeah. The superstition about infants seeing themselves in mirrors and its prevention using a mole's foot is a peculiar one.
It is, yeah, very specific.
Yeah. Witch medals and the folklore connecting the Magi to gypsies and their lore add another layer to this whole complex web of beliefs.
Right, linking religious figures with the occult.
Yeah, yeah. The Romagna practice involving newborn babies, witches, taking the cradle to the attic and placing salt and open Bible gold chains and rings for protection is a fascinating ritual.
It is, yeah, a lot of different elements at play there.
Yeah. Divination with melted lead is an ancient practice, and the interpretation of shapes and even taking it to bed to influence dreams shows a deep belief in its power.
Yeah, it's like using the divination to tap into the subconscious.
Yeah, right. Yeah. The specific incantation for lead divination asks for good fortune and protection from evil people and emphasizes the virtue of copper.
Interesting. So specific metals with specific properties?
Yeah, yeah. Pyromancy or divination by fire is another ancient method, and the Tuscan invocation to fire for good fortune is really beautiful.
That is, yeah, it's like a direct appeal to this powerful element.
Yeah, Yeah. A spell using a scaldino with burning incense and cumin is described as a way to identify and harm a bewitcher or to remove a spell.
So a more aggressive form of counter magic.
Yeah, yeah. The source notes the prevalence of evil incantations in Tuscan witchcraft, suggesting they might be the oldest forms of sorcery.
Yeah, the darker side of folk magic.
Yeah, yeah. Despite academic debates, the persistence of these Romagnola spells in the same region as the ancient Etruscans and Latins suggests their ancient origins.
Yeah, that continuity is really compelling.
It is, yeah. The amuletic properties of kidney-shaped black pebbles found worldwide are mentioned. So again, this kind of universal belief in certain objects.
Yeah, certain shapes.
Yeah. A Tuscan ritual for love divination using hot water salt, 3 girls' red wool bags with ashes and sacred wafers is another complex ritual.
It is, yeah, a lot going on there.
Yeah. The amuletic stone against intoxication and for memory comes with a conjuration.
So words and objects working together.
Yeah, yeah. The witch's garland, made of knotted cords with feathers used in Florence, and its similarity to the witch ladder shows a continuity of these magical tools.
Yeah, those knotted objects are very common in protective magic.
They are, yeah. A spell to protect a house from witches entering in animal form invokes Pluto and the power of ringing bells. So again, that blending of classical mythology with folk beliefs.
Yeah, it's fascinating how those different traditions can come together.
Yeah, yeah. And then the account of the Milanese mob accusing Angela Micheletti of bewitching a child in 1891 is a stark reminder of the real dangers of these beliefs.
Yeah, it shows how these fears could lead to violence.
Yeah, it's a dark side of the story.
It is, yeah.
Ring prophecy, using a consecrated ring verbena and a cylinder with letters, is a more elaborate form of divination.
Yeah, very structured.
Yeah. Pine cones used as amulets requiring annual replanting show this connection to nature and cyclical view of fortune.
Yeah, it's like you have to actively cultivate good luck.
Exactly. Yeah. The belief that pregnant women looking at images of rural deities or lairs might have children resembling them and becoming wizards is a very specific belief.
It is, yeah, about prenatal influence.
Right, right. An old German spell against fever is presented, which parallels a Chaldean incantation against the plague.
Interesting. So similar ideas across different cultures.
Yeah, yeah. And finally, an ancient spell involving a twig broken and thrown into a fire to break a curse.
A simple but powerful act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we've gone through these historical accounts, it's clear that the ghosts of the Etruscan Empire and the ancient world are still very much present in modern Italy.
They are, yeah, their influence is undeniable.
And what's really striking is that even as late as the end of the 19th century, these weren't just stories for many people, they were a lived reality.
Right. These beliefs had real power.
Yeah. So it makes you wonder what other ghosts might still be lingering in our own modern world,
Yeah.
Influencing us in ways we don't even realize.
It's a great question to consider.
It is, yeah. And we encourage you to delve deeper into these sources and continue your own exploration. But for now, thank you for joining us on Occult Archives.
Until next time.